The Geneva International Diplomatic Center never slept, but at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, the building held its breath. Emergency sessions were called at this hour only when the world was about to shift on its axis. Lucy Morgan pushed her cleaning cart down the marble corridor, her footsteps muffled by years of practice moving like a shadow through these halls. Her badge read, L. Morgan, Cleaning Unit 7. The other staff called her the Ghost because she appeared and disappeared without anyone noticing. What they didn't know was that Lucy had once been the most sought-after interpreter in international diplomacy. Her real name was Lucia Moreau, and for 15 years, she'd been the invisible bridge between nations. 9 languages flowed from her tongue as naturally as breathing: Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, French, German, Spanish, Pashto, Serbian, and English. She could switch between them faster than most people could form a single thought, catching nuances that electronic systems missed entirely. Presidents had whispered their deepest fears to her, knowing she would carry their words across linguistic barriers with perfect precision. But that was before March 15, 2003, before a small room in Sarajevo. Before she watched a translator deliberately mistranslate a peace offer, turning words of reconciliation into threats of violence. When Lucy realized what was happening, every rule of diplomatic protocol screamed at her to stay silent. Interpreters observe, they don't participate. They translate, they don't intervene. But Lucy couldn't watch another massacre unfold because of lies. Stop, she had shouted, her voice cutting through heated arguments. That's not what he said. He's offering to share power, not threatening to take it. The room fell into stunned silence. The negotiations collapsed within hours, not because of mistrust, but because an interpreter had broken the sacred rule of neutrality. The media destroyed her reputation overnight. Headlines called her the interpreter who forgot her place. Her security clearance was revoked, her career ended, her name blacklisted from every international organization. Nobody wanted to hear that she had prevented a genocide. Nobody cared that her intervention had saved lives. For 12 years, Lucia Moreau had vanished from the world of international relations. Lucy Morgan, night janitor, was born from those ashes. Tonight, as she moved through the diplomatic facility, something felt different. The tension was visible from the moment 2 motorcades arrived, flanked by armed security details. She recognized the flags immediately, one from a Middle Eastern nation still recovering from decades of internal conflict, another from an Eastern European country with fresh memories of ethnic cleansing. Between these 2 nations lay a complex web of arms. Deals, territorial disputes, and historical grievances stretching back generations. But tonight's crisis was immediate. Intelligence reports suggested extremist group planning, coordinated attacks in both countries using weapons that could only have come from government stockpiles. Each side blamed the other. Each side demanded answers. Each side was prepared to take military action if those answers didn't come. Lucy emptied wastebaskets and organized scattered papers, her trained ear catching fragments of heated conversations in multiple languages. The junior staff looked terrified. The security personnel had their hands close to their weapons. A UN observer whispered urgently to his colleague, "This is exactly how the last 3 conflicts started. Complete miscommunication escalating into violence." As Lucy mopped the floors outside conference room A, she heard raised voices, the scraping of chairs, the sound of fists hitting tables. Through the crack under the door, she could see shadows moving aggressively. Her hands gripped the mop handle tighter. She had sworn never to set foot in another negotiation room, never to risk another diplomatic incident, never to trust her voice with the fate of nations again. But some voices, when the world needs them most, refuse to stay silent forever. The Emergency session was spiraling toward disaster. And Lucy Morgan, once Lucia Moreau, the most trusted voice in European diplomacy, stood in the hallway with her cleaning cart, listening to the beginning of what could become the next international crisis. Tonight would test whether 12 years of silence had been penance enough, or if some mistakes could never be forgiven. The ghost in the halls was about to face her past, and the world would never be the same. Ambassador Robert Hassan from the Middle Eastern delegation spoke first, his voice heavy with frustration as he addressed the room in rapid Arabic. The automated translation system, struggling with his cultural references and emotional undertones, rendered his opening words as, "We will not accept your lies and deception." But what he actually said was, "We cannot continue to let our children pay for our father's mistakes." Ambassador Viktor Petrov's face darkened immediately. The weathered Eastern European diplomat, whose own family had fled during the wars of the 90s, responded in sharp Serbian. His tone matched what he believed was aggression from the other side. The machine translated his response as, "Your threats mean nothing to us." His actual words were, "We have suffered too much to let fear guide our decisions." Lucy Morgan pressed her ear closer to the door, her heart sinking as she recognized a familiar pattern of catastrophic miscommunication. The two primary interpreters, both with top-level security clearance, had been detained at the security checkpoint. Sophisticated listening devices had been discovered in their equipment, devices so advanced that even security experts weren't sure who had planted them. Without professional interpretation, the meeting had to proceed with automated translation systems and junior staff members whose language skills were inadequate at best. Within minutes, both ambassadors were standing, their voices raised, their security details moving closer to the table. Neither understood what the other was actually saying, but both heard threats and hostility in every mistranslated phrase. "Tell him we will defend ourselves," Hassan shouted in Arabic. "He says they're preparing for war." The terrified junior interpreters stammered back. "That's not what I said." Hassan protested, but his protests were translated as, "We are ready for whatever comes." Petrov slammed his hand on the table, his words in Serbian coming out as a torrent of anger that the system butchered into incomprehensible threats. Lucy abandoned her mop and moved closer to the door. Through the small window, she could see phone calls being made to capitals, military advisors being awakened, emergency protocols being activated. The room was reaching a breaking point. Security personnel had their hands on their weapons. Diplomatic immunity wouldn't matter if someone decided the other side had issued a declaration of war. Marcus Wells, the facility's head of security, noticed Lucy lingering near the conference room. "Morgan, you need to clear this area. Emergency session in progress." "Sir, I think they're having translation problems," Lucy said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus glanced at her dismissively. "That's not your concern. Please move along." But as Lucy reluctantly pushed her cart away, she heard Ambassador Hassan's voice rise to near shouting, "Why won't you listen to what I'm actually saying?" The automated system translated this as, "You refuse to acknowledge our superior position." Lucy stopped walking. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cart handle. She had spent 12 years in exile, 12 years cleaning up other people's messes while the world forgot her name. She had chosen silence, believing her voice had caused enough trouble for one lifetime. But silence, she was beginning to realize, could be just as dangerous as speaking out. Through the conference room window, she watched Viktor Petrov rise. From his chair, his face flushed with anger. His security detail stepped forward. Hassan's bodyguards responded in kind. The junior interpreters looked paralyzed with fear. This was exactly how wars started, not with grand declarations or planned invasions, but with misunderstood words escalating into irreversible actions. Lucy thought of the village that had been erased from the map because she had stayed silent when she should have spoken. She thought of the children who died because diplomats couldn't understand each other. She thought of all the conflicts that could have been prevented if someone, anyone, had simply ensured that people heard what was actually being said rather than what they thought they heard. The automated system continued its mechanical butchering of human emotion and cultural nuance. Each mistranslation pushed the two delegations further apart, deeper into mutual suspicion and hostility. In the hallway, Lucy Morgan made a decision that would either redeem her past or destroy what little peace she had found in anonymity. But first, she needed to get closer to that room. And Marcus Wells, head of security, was standing directly in her path. "I need you to vacate this entire corridor," Marcus Wells announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "No cleaning staff beyond this point until further notice." Lucy Morgan looked up from her card, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in 3 years of working at the facility. "Sir, there are documents scattered on the floor in there. Important papers that—" "Did I stutter, Morgan?" Marcus stepped closer, his tone turning condescending. "This is a classified diplomatic emergency. You don't have clearance to be anywhere near this area." Through the conference room windows, Lucy could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. Ambassador Hassan was pacing, gesturing frantically as he spoke into his phone. Ambassador Petrov had his arms crossed, his expression stone cold. The junior interpreters looked ready to flee. "I understand, sir, but—" "No buts." Marcus grabbed the handle of her cleaning cart. "Security risk assessment supersedes janitorial duties. You're done here for the night." As he began wheeling her cart away, Lucy heard a crash from inside the conference room. Someone had thrown something, a water glass, perhaps, or a briefing folder. Raised voices echoed through the heavy doors, no longer attempting diplomacy or restraint. "Please," Lucy said, her voice barely audible. "Let me just—" "Morgan, I'm going to say this once more, and then I'm calling your supervisor." Marcus's voice carried a threat that made several passing staff members turn to stare. "You are a night janitor. You empty trash cans and mop floors. You do not insert yourself into matters of international security. Is that clear?" The words hit Lucy like physical blows. She had once stood in rooms where presidents consulted her before making decisions that would affect millions of lives. She had translated ceasefire commands that ended ethnic cleansing. She had interpreted the final words of dying peacekeepers to their families. Now she was being told that her voice didn't matter, that her presence was unwelcome, that she was nothing more than someone who emptied trash cans and mopped floors. "Crystal clear, sir," she whispered. But as Marcus turned to leave with her cart, the conference room door burst open. Ambassador Hassan stormed out, his face dark with fury, followed closely by his security detail. He was shouting into his phone, in rapid Arabic, words that Lucy understood perfectly, words that made her blood run cold. He wasn't calling his capital to report failed negotiations. He was calling his military commanders, authorizing defensive measures that would be interpreted as offensive preparations by Petrov's government. Ambassador Petrov appeared in the doorway seconds later, also on his phone, also speaking in tones that promised escalation rather than de-escalation. The junior interpreters emerged last, looking shell-shocked and defeated. One of them, a young woman named Jennifer, approached Marcus hesitantly. "Sir, we've lost complete communication," she said, her voice shaking. "The translation systems failed completely, and we don't have anyone qualified to handle Arabic-Serbian interpretation at this level. The ambassadors are calling their capitals. And I think they're both preparing for military action." Marcus Wells, for the first time since Lucy had known him, looked uncertain. What do you mean? No one qualified. The kind of interpretation needed here requires years of diplomatic experience and cultural expertise. It's not just about language. It's about understanding historical context, religious references, political subtleties. The automated systems can't handle it, and none of us have sufficient experience with both Arabic and Serbian at the diplomatic level. Lucy watched this. Exchange from 20 feet away, her heart pounding. She knew she should walk away, should accept that her role in international affairs was over, should stick to emptying trash cans and mopping floors, as Marcus had so clearly reminded her. But she also knew that within the next hour, 2 countries would begin military mobilization based on a conversation that had been completely misunderstood by everyone involved. As Ambassador Hassan's voice grew louder on his phone call, as Ambassador Petrov's security detail began moving toward the exits, as junior staff members scattered like frightened birds, Lucy Morgan made a decision that would either save 2 nations from unnecessary conflict or cost her the only job she had left in the world. She stepped forward, cleared her throat, and spoke in a voice that hadn't been heard in diplomatic circles for 12 years. "Excuse me," she said quietly, "but I think I can help." Marcus Wells turned slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation to something approaching disbelief. "Morgan, I thought I made myself clear." "You did," Lucy interrupted, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But if those 2 ambassadors continue arguing like this, there will be war." The sentence came out first in perfect Arabic, capturing not just the words, but the cultural weight behind them. Then it repeated in flawless Serbian, with the exact intonation that conveyed respect rather than threat. Finally, it concluded in diplomatic French, the neutral language of international relations. Every conversation stopped. Every phone call was paused. Every eye in the corridor turned toward the woman in the cleaning uniform who had just demonstrated a linguistic ability that nobody in that building possessed. Ambassador Hassan ended his call mid-sentence, his weathered face showing confusion and something that might have been recognition. Ambassador Petrov lowered his phone, staring at Lucy with an expression of growing amazement. The silence was deafening. Who are you?" Hassan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucy set down the mop she had been holding, removed her protective mask and safety glasses, and looked directly at the 2 men who had been moments away from storming out of the building and potentially starting an international crisis. "My name is Lucia Moreau," she said simply, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had stood in far more dangerous rooms than this one. Ambassador Petrov's face went completely white. "Lucia Moreau, the interpreter from the Balkan conflicts. You were there. You were there during the siege of Sarajevo," Hassan added, his anger forgotten. "You translated the final evacuation orders before the shelling started." Lucy nodded. "I was there for many evacuations." "My son," Petrov's voice cracked with emotion. "My 8-year-old son was trapped in a building when the mortar began falling. You didn't just translate the rescue coordinates. You ran into the street under fire and carried him to safety yourself." The corridor was transfixed. Here was a legend, someone whose name was whispered in diplomatic circles, standing before them in a janitor's uniform. Marcus Wells looked like someone had just told him his cleaning lady was actually a former head of state. Jennifer, the junior interpreter, stared with her mouth open. "But then you disappeared," the UN observer said, stepping forward cautiously. "After the incident in Bosnia, the newspapers said you'd violated protocol, that you'd interfered in negotiations." "I prevented a massacre," Lucy replied quietly, "but I broke the rules to do it, so I was removed from service." "And you've been working here as a cleaner all this time?" Hassan asked, incredulous. "I clean up messes," Lucy said with a slight smile. "It's what I've always done, just in different ways." Marcus Wells started to speak, but Ambassador Petrov held up his hand. "Ma'am, could you help us here? We desperately need someone who can accurately translate between our delegations. Lives may depend on it." Lucy looked at her abandoned cleaning cart, then at the two men who represented nations on the brink of conflict. She had sworn never to set foot in another negotiation room, never to risk another diplomatic incident, never to trust her voice with the fate of nations again. But she also remembered the village that had been erased from the map because someone had stayed silent when they should have spoken. "I can help," she said, "but only if you both promise to listen to what each other is actually saying, not what you think you're hearing." Both ambassadors nodded immediately. Marcus Wells, looking like he was still processing the revelation that his night janitor was a diplomatic legend, stepped aside without a word. As Lucy walked toward conference room A, Jennifer whispered to another staff member, "Do you realize what just happened? Lucia Moreau is the most famous interpreter in modern history. She's prevented more wars than most people even know about." Lucy paused at the conference room door, her hand on the handle. For 12 years, she had chosen invisibility, believing her voice had caused enough trouble for one lifetime. Tonight, she would discover whether her silence had been penance enough, or whether some gifts were too important to keep buried. The ghost in the halls was about to step back into the light, and the world held its breath. Lucy entered conference room A with no preparation, no briefing materials, no electronic equipment, just her mind, her gift, and decades of experience navigating the most dangerous conversations in human history. The room fell silent as she took her position at the front, between the two delegations. Marcus Wells stationed himself by the door, still looking stunned by the revelation of who his night janitor really was. The junior interpreters moved to the back, eager to observe a master at work. "Gentlemen," Lucy began, her voice calm and professional, "we're going to start over. Ambassador Hassan, please tell Ambassador Petrov what brought you here tonight. Speak naturally, as you would to a friend." Hassan looked uncertain for a moment, then began speaking in Arabic. But this wasn't the frustrated, rapid-fire speech from earlier. Lucy's presence seemed to calm him, allowing him to express himself with the nuance and complexity that the situation demanded. Lucy listened intently, not just to his words, but to the cultural context, the emotional undertones, the historical references that gave his statement its full meaning. When he finished, she turned to Petrov. "Ambassador Hassan says his country has lost too many young people to violence, and he cannot bear to see another generation sacrificed to misunderstanding. He acknowledges that weapons have gone missing from government stockpiles, but he believes this was done by extremist groups acting without official sanction. He's asking for your help in tracking these weapons before they can be used against innocent people in both your countries." Petrov's expression shifted dramatically. The hostility was replaced by something closer to understanding, even sympathy. "Tell him," Petrov said in Serbian, "that my country has also suffered from extremist violence. We don't want to accuse his government of deliberately arming these groups. We want to work together to stop them." Lucy translated not just the facts, but the emotional weight behind them. She found ways to express strength without aggression, determination without threat. "He's not questioning your integrity," she explained to Hassan. "He's asking for your partnership in solving a problem that threatens both your people's safety." For the next 90 minutes, Lucy worked magic that only comes from decades of experience and natural talent. She caught historical references, cultural nuances, and emotional undertones that no automated system could ever understand. When Hassan spoke of his people's need for security, Lucy translated not just his concerns, but the generational trauma that drove them. When Petrov described his nation's defensive measures, she conveyed protection rather than aggression, caution rather than hostility. She translated fear into understanding, suspicion into curiosity, anger into shared concern. Marcus Wells watched from the door, occasionally stepping into the hallway to coordinate with his security team. During one of these absences, Jennifer approached Lucy during a brief break. "How do you do it?" the young interpreter asked. "How do you make them understand each other when they were ready to declare war 2 hours ago?" Lucy smiled gently. "Language isn't about words, Jennifer. It's about building bridges between hearts that have forgotten how to trust each other. When someone speaks in anger, listen for the fear underneath. When they make demands, listen for the needs they're trying to protect." By the end of the session, both ambassadors were leaning forward, engaged in genuine dialogue, working together to solve their mutual problem rather than fighting over who was to blame. They signed a preliminary agreement for joint investigation and shared intelligence, potentially preventing the coordinated attacks that had brought them to the brink of conflict. When it was over, Ambassador Hassan approached Lucy with tears in his eyes. "You didn't just translate our words tonight. You translated our hearts." Ambassador Petrov shook her hand firmly. "My son is grown now, married with children of his own. But I never forgot what you did that day in Sarajevo. Tonight, you've saved lives again." As the delegations prepared to leave, Marcus Wells approached Lucy hesitantly. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I had no idea who you were, and I spoke to you in a way that was completely inappropriate." Lucy looked at him thoughtfully. "You treated me exactly as you would treat any night janitor, Marcus. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem comes when we assume that titles determine worth, or that the person mopping the floor can also be someone who might have something important to contribute." "The UN has already called," Marcus said. "They want to speak with you about returning to diplomatic service. Full credentials, senior position, salary that would make you very comfortable." Lucy picked up her cleaning supplies, which had been moved to the corner of the room. "I prefer the night shift, Marcus. There's more truth in empty hallways than in crowded conference rooms." But as she prepared to resume her rounds, Lucy knew that word of tonight would spread through the diplomatic community like wildfire. Her years of invisibility were over, whether she wanted them to be or not. The question was, after 12 years of silence, was she ready to let the world hear her voice again? Within 72 hours, Lucy's phone, a simple device she used mainly for emergency contact with the cleaning service, began ringing constantly. She had 3 separate job offers by Thursday morning. The United Nations wanted her as senior linguistic advisor with full diplomatic credentials and a salary that would make her wealthy. NATO offered her a consulting position that would put her back at the center of international relations. The European Union requested her services for their most sensitive negotiations going forward. She declined them all. "I prefer the night shift," she told the UN representative who visited her small Geneva apartment. "There's more truth in empty hallways than in crowded conference rooms." But word of that Tuesday night had spread through the diplomatic community like wildfire, not through official channels or press releases, but through the quiet conversations that happened between trusted colleagues. Young diplomats and veteran negotiators alike began finding excuses to work late at the Geneva facility. They hoped to catch a glimpse of the woman who had once been the most trusted voice in international relations, and who now emptied their wastebaskets and cleaned their conference tables. Marcus Wells, still processing his own assumptions about worth and visibility, had become an unexpected ally. Instead of restricting Lucy's access to sensitive areas, he began quietly facilitating opportunities for interested staff to interact with her. "Could you teach me Mandarin?" asked David Patterson, a junior attached from the Canadian Embassy, approaching Lucy during her rounds. "Do you remember how to handle ancient Greek dialects?" inquired Dr. Rebecca Torres, a scholar working on historical treaties. How do you translate concepts that don't exist in the target language? Wondered Amanda Clark, a young interpreter fresh from university. Lucy never opened formal classes, never advertised her availability, never charged for her time. But she began sharing stories as she worked, stories from the front lines of history where a misplaced emphasis could start a war, where finding the right metaphor could save thousands of lives, where understanding silence was sometimes more important than translating words. Language is not about words, she would tell them as she organized the papers they left scattered on meeting tables. It's about building bridges between hearts that have forgotten how to trust each other. Her students, if they could be called that, carried these lessons into every negotiation they attended. They learned to listen for what wasn't being said, to translate intentions along with statements, to recognize when fear was masquerading as anger. The changes were subtle but profound. Junior staff members who had been intimidated by language barriers began asking better questions. Senior diplomats found themselves actually understanding their counterparts' positions instead of simply preparing rebuttals. Conference rooms that had previously echoed with frustration and miscommunication began hosting genuine dialogue. But not everyone was pleased with Lucy's growing influence. Dr. Richard Hartley, the facility's director of translation services, had built his career on being the final authority on diplomatic interpretation. His department controlled all official translation contracts, managed the automated systems, and oversaw the certification of diplomatic interpreters. Lucy's presence threatened everything he had built. "We have protocols for a reason," he told Marcus Wells during a tense meeting in his office. "This woman has no current security clearance, no official diplomatic status, and a documented history of violating professional standards. She cannot be allowed to continue operating in this facility." Marcus, who had done his own research into Lucy's background after that Tuesday night, chose his words carefully. Dr. Hartley, her intervention prevented what intelligence analysts have confirmed would have been a devastating international crisis. "That's irrelevant," Hartley snapped. "She broke protocol in Bosnia. She was rightfully removed from service. And she has no business inserting herself into diplomatic affairs now. I'm filing a formal complaint with facility administration." What Hartley didn't know was that several of Lucy's informal students had begun documenting the improvements in their negotiation outcomes. Amanda Clark had successfully mediated a trade dispute that had been stalled for 6 months. David Patterson had facilitated a breakthrough in environmental negotiations that had been declared hopeless by senior diplomats. Dr. Torres had used Lucy's techniques to resolve a conflict over historical reparations that had threatened to derail a major peace process. The evidence was mounting that Lucy's approach to interpretation and communication was producing results that traditional methods had failed to achieve. But evidence, as Lucy knew from experience, didn't always matter when institutional power was threatened. On Friday evening, as she prepared for her usual weekend shift, Lucy found an official notice taped to her locker. "Report to administration Monday morning, 9 a.m. Disciplinary review regarding unauthorized activities beyond assigned duties." Lucy stared at the notice for a long moment. She had spent 12 years paying for the crime of speaking truth at the wrong moment. Now it seemed she would pay again for the crime of speaking truth at exactly the right moment. But this time, she wouldn't face the consequences alone. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made Geneva feel like a city holding its breath. Lucy arrived at the administration office at 8:55 a.m., wearing her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit she had bought years ago for job interviews that never came. Dr. Richard Hartley sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, flanked by 2 administrators Lucy didn't recognize. Marcus Wells stood to one side, his expression carefully neutral. The setup felt deliberately intimidating, designed to make her feel small and powerless. "Ms. Morgan," Hartley began, consulting a thick folder. "Or should I say, Ms. Moreau? It seems you've been operating under false pretenses for quite some time." "I never lied about my identity," Lucy replied calmly. "I simply didn't volunteer information about my past. Information that would have disqualified you from employment here, given your history of violating diplomatic protocols." Hartley's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the cards. "You were terminated from international service for interference in official negotiations. That termination includes a lifetime ban from participation in diplomatic affairs." Lucy had expected this moment for 12 years. "I understand. Furthermore," Hartley continued, "you have been conducting unauthorized activities within this facility, teaching unaccredited interpretation techniques, providing unofficial translation services, and inserting yourself into matters far beyond your assigned duties as cleaning staff. I helped prevent a war," Lucy said quietly. "You violated protocol." Hartley's composure cracked slightly. "You have no current security clearance, no official authority, and no right to involve yourself in diplomatic communications. The fact that your interference happened to produce a positive outcome doesn't excuse the breach of security and professional standards." Lucy nodded. "You're absolutely right. I broke the rules." Hartley looked surprised by her admission, but quickly recovered. "Given the seriousness of these violations, we have no choice but to terminate your employment immediately and recommend that you be barred from any future work in diplomatic facilities." Lucy felt the familiar weight of institutional rejection, the same crushing sense of being discarded that she had experienced 12 years ago. She started to rise from her chair, ready to accept defeat once again. That's when the conference room door opened. Ambassador Hassan entered first, followed by Ambassador Petrov. Behind them came David Patterson, Amanda Clark, Dr. Rebecca Torres, and a dozen other diplomats and staff members who had learned from Lucy's quiet teachings. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Hassan said, his voice carrying the formal authority of diplomatic protocol, "but we understand there's a disciplinary hearing concerning Ms. Lucia Moreau." Hartley looked flustered. "This is a personnel matter, Ambassador. It concerns all of us," Petrov interrupted. "Ms. Moreau's work directly prevented a military conflict between our nations. The preliminary agreement we signed has already led to the arrest of 3 terrorist cells and the recovery of stolen weapons." Amanda Clark stepped forward, holding a folder thick with documents. "Dr. Hartley, I've documented 17 separate diplomatic breakthroughs in the past month alone, all achieved using communication techniques learned from Ms. Moreau. The success rate of negotiations involving staff she's mentored has increased by 340%. "These are not official metrics," Hartley protested. "Ms. Moreau has no authority to train diplomatic personnel." David Patterson opened his own folder. "Actually, sir, we've been in contact with the UN Office of Human Resources. Ms. Moreau's lifetime ban was based on a disciplinary action that has since been reviewed and overturned. The official finding was that her intervention in Bosnia was not only justified but prevented significant loss of life." Lucy stared at him. "What?" Dr. Torres smiled. "The review was completed 8 years ago, Lucia. But since you had disappeared from diplomatic service, no one could locate you to inform you of the decision. Your security clearance was restored. In 2015, you've been eligible to return to international service this entire time." The room fell silent. Lucy felt the world tilting on its axis. Hartley's face had gone pale. This doesn't change the fact that she was operating without proper authorization in this facility. "Actually, it does," Marcus Wells said, speaking for the first time. He pulled out his own set of documents. Ms. Moreau's restored security clearance gives her broad authority to assist with diplomatic communications in emergency situations. Her actions last Tuesday were not only legal, but officially commendable. Ambassador Hassan approached Lucy, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "Lucia, the international community owes you an apology. We failed you 12 years ago, and we failed you again by letting you believe you were in exile all this time. The question now," Ambassador Petrov added, "is whether you're willing to forgive us and consider returning to the work you were born to do." Lucy looked around the room at the faces watching her expectantly. These people had risked their own professional standings to defend her, to validate her worth, to ensure she wouldn't be silenced again. For 12 years, she had believed that speaking truth had cost her everything. Now she understood that speaking truth had simply been preparing her for this moment. "Dr. Hardley," she said, standing to face the man who had tried to destroy her, "you're right about one thing. I did break the rules. But sometimes the rules are wrong, and sometimes staying silent costs more lives than speaking up." She turned to the ambassadors and diplomats who had come to her defense. "I accept your offer to return to diplomatic service. But I have one condition." "Name it," Hassan said immediately. Lucy smiled. "I keep the night shift. There's still more truth in empty hallways than in crowded conference rooms, and some of the most important conversations happen when the world thinks no one is listening." The room erupted in applause, and Lucy Morgan, Lucia Moreau, prepared to step back into the light, carrying with her everything she had learned in the shadows. 3 months later, a small bronze plaque appeared outside the main conference hall at the Geneva International Diplomatic Center. It read, "In honor of those who clean up the messes others are afraid to acknowledge." Nobody knew who commissioned it. Nobody asked. Lucy still worked the night shift, but now she did so with full diplomatic credentials and a salary that reflected her true value. More importantly, she had become something unique in the world of international relations, an official interpreter who specialized in impossible situations. When the Syrian ceasefire talks reached their breaking point at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, Lucy was called in to bridge the gap between exhausted negotiators who had forgotten how to hear each other. When the Kashmir border dispute erupted into shouting matches between diplomats speaking 7 different languages, Lucy spent 18 hours translating not just words, but decades of historical trauma. Her approach had revolutionized diplomatic interpretation. Instead of simply converting words from one language to another, she translated entire cultural contexts, emotional landscapes, and historical perspectives. She taught others to listen for the fear beneath anger, the hope beneath demands, the shared humanity beneath political positions. The young diplomats she had mentored during her janitor days had become some of the most effective negotiators. In international service, Amanda Clark was appointed to lead peace talks in West Africa. David Patterson was selected for the UN Climate Council. Dr. Torres published a groundbreaking paper on empathetic translation in conflict resolution that became required reading in diplomatic schools worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, Lucy's story had become legend among a new generation of international workers, not just interpreters and diplomats, but security guards, administrative assistants, maintenance staff, and cleaning crews. They learned that expertise doesn't always come with titles. That wisdom often hides in unexpected places. That the person everyone overlooks might be exactly the person everyone needs to hear. Marcus Wells, who had learned more about unconscious bias in one Tuesday night than in 20 years of security work, established informal mentorship programs throughout the facility. "Everyone has something to contribute," became his motto. "Our job is to create space for those contributions to be heard." Dr. Richard Hartley quietly transferred to a different department. where his rigid adherence to protocol served him better in administrative roles that didn't require human flexibility. Lucy never returned to the translator's booth in the traditional sense. She never accepted the high-profile positions that would have made her wealthy and famous. She never sought recognition for her role in preventing what intelligence analysts later confirmed would have been a devastating series of coordinated attacks. But her influence spread quietly through a generation of diplomats who learned that sometimes the most important voice in any room belongs to the person everyone assumes isn't worth listening to. On quiet nights, when Lucy walked through the halls of the Geneva facility, she sometimes paused outside Conference Room A, where a small memorial plaque had been installed by the joint request of Ambassadors Hassan and Petrov. It simply read, "Where understanding began." She would remember that Tuesday night when the world had balanced on the edge of conflict, when automated systems had failed and human communication had nearly collapsed entirely. She would remember the moment when she chose to speak rather than stay silent, when she decided that some truths were too important to keep buried. Her students, and they were students now, officially enrolled in the Moreau Institute for Cross-Cultural Communication that had been established with funding from 12 nations, often asked her about courage. How do you find the strength to speak when you know it might cost you everything? Courage isn't about being unafraid, Lucy would tell them as she reviewed their translation exercises during her midnight rounds. Courage is about understanding that some silences are more dangerous than any consequences of speaking truth. In our noisy, connected, overwhelming world, we often assume that the most important voices belong to the people with the biggest platforms, the highest positions, the most followers. But sometimes, just sometimes, the person who can change everything is the one everybody else has stopped seeing. Sometimes the janitor in the hallway has been listening to the most important conversations of all. The woman who had once translated ceasefire commands that ended ethnic cleansing, who had interpreted the final words of dying peacekeepers to their families, who had spent 36 hours straight translating during negotiations that redrew the map of Europe, had found her voice again. But more importantly, she had taught others to find this. Late at night, when the world's most powerful people slept peacefully in their beds, Lucy Moreau walked the halls of international diplomacy, cleaning up messes and building bridges between hearts that had forgotten how to trust each other. Her mop bucket held cleaning supplies, but her mind held the words that could prevent wars. And in a world that desperately needed people willing to speak truth at exactly the right moment, Lucy had learned the most important lesson of all, that expertise doesn't always wear a suit. That wisdom often comes with work gloves, and that the person everyone dismisses as just the janitor might be exactly the person whose voice the world has been waiting to hear. The ghost in the halls had become the guardian of peace, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with one person having the courage to say, quietly but clearly, "Excuse me, but I think you're misunderstanding each other." In the end, Lucy Morgan had learned that being forgotten by the world wasn't a punishment, it was preparation. And when the world needed her voice most, she was ready to use it. Some stories end with victory parades and public recognition. This one ended with something far more valuable, the knowledge that speaking truth, even when it costs everything, is never a mistake. And in the quiet corridors of international diplomacy, where the fate of nations is decided in whispered conversations, the woman who cleaned up everyone else's messes had finally learned to clean up her own, not by forgetting who she used to be, but by becoming exactly who she was meant to be all along. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.